Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'd like to welcome everyone to Lecture 2 of Philosophy, Ideology, and History, a Futuristic Examination from Modern Europe to W.E.B Du Bois and James Baldwin. This is organized and hosted by the Saturday Free School of Philadelphia. I'll begin by reading our call for these events. War, poverty, white supremacy, and inequality consume the lives of billions throughout the world and the majority in our nation. The 1%, the oligarchs, and the ruling class generally are consumed in universal selfishness and hatred of the people. In times like these, the people ask, what can be done? Part of answering such a question turns us to ideas, philosophy, and ideology. For those who seek to know the world in order to change it, our time calls for a deep examination of society and its assumptions. We welcome all to a series of lectures and discussions led by Dr. Anthony Monteiro, which will address the great modern philosophers, including Descartes, Hegel, Marx, and conclude with the philosophies of those in the Black radical tradition like W.E.B Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., and James Baldwin. This series is dedicated to the 150th birth anniversary of VI Lenin. So the structure of today is going to be Dr. Monteiro starting with about a 35-minute lecture. And please feel free to share your comments in the comments section of the live stream. And after his presentation is done, then we will address some of your comments. So I would like to begin by turning it over to Dr. Anthony Monteiro, the organizer, facilitator of the Free School, Du Boisian scholar, lifelong Philadelphia resident, and activist.
Thank you, Johan. It's very nice to see you. And to everybody out there, it's very nice to be with you on this live stream. You know, I just wanted to start today by explaining a couple of things in the title of this series. I like to say conversations. And that is, first, why do we call it a futuristic examination? And the reason for that is that we will conclude this series of conversations with the idea that the crisis that is upon us is more than a crisis of a virus or a healthcare crisis. It's even more than a crisis of the system of capitalism, and it is both of those. It is a crisis of civilization, and by crisis of civilization, we are talking more in the sphere of history and worldview and fundamental beliefs and grounding institutions that all of which have existed for a significant period of time, and we would argue at least for 400 years. And we identify this crisis of civilization in much the ways that Du Bois, W.E.B Du Bois, Baldwin, and Paul Robeson in particular have identified it, a civilization that begins with the transatlantic slave trade, the colonization of Africa and Asia, which was so decisive in shifting the center of world history from the dark nations of the world in the main to Europe. So that's how all of that and history and ideology and civilization fit into it. The other thing is the transformation of human arrangements, human relationships from the age of Europe to the age of humanity. And that will bring with it clearly a change in the ways that economies work, in the ways that political systems work, in the ways that humanity governs itself, and in the ways that humanity will allow itself to be governed. So that's maybe 2 weeks down the line. We want to get to that, but I just wanted to establish that so people have a sense of what we're doing. Because a lot of people say, oh, you guys are doing philosophy and you're doing mainly Western thinkers. We are doing Western philosophers because of the profound role of Europe in the transformation of the world. The impact of Europe upon world history is undeniable, in a sense, irreversible. It is not a subjective question of whether or not we like European philosophy or whether or not European philosophers contributed to great acts of criminal acts against humanity by European people or any of that. It is an objective fact that anyone who is concerned with the great movement of history and anybody that lives in this time under these circumstances should be interested in the historical movement away from what has been to what should be, might be, and in some ways inevitably will be. Now, last week, I just want to go back over some things. We said we were not doing an academic class on philosophy. I'm not an academic philosopher. Even if I could be, I wouldn't want to be an academic philosopher for reasons that if you ask me, I'll tell you. I think, well, I'll tell you part of the reason I'm not. Part of the reason I think to do philosophy academically is to lose the significance politically and ideologically and historically of the people you're trying to talk about. It's just like if one tries to study the music of John Coltrane academically. You are studying Coltrane out of the context of history, politics, ideology, Black folk, Philadelphia, the 60s, the 70s, the 50s. You know, hey, you lose John Coltrane. That enterprise is good for the musicologist or the academic, but for someone who really wants to understand the music of John Coltrane and all of those around him, that academic way of doing it kind of emasculates it, takes its meaning in human terms away. Same thing with academic philosophy. You can't understand it in its context by doing it in the ways that most academics do it. The other thing is by connecting philosophy to ideology. By that I mean connecting it to the political and ideological struggles of the time. For example, we began last week not with a philosopher, but with Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, who put 95 theses upon, I said theses, not what it may have sounded like, on the door of the church in the city or town where he was a priest. And among his theses was that the church could not mediate man's or a man or woman's relationship to God. And therefore, to be a moral or ethical or good person, to even be a Christian, each individual could establish a relationship with God and did not need the priest, did not need the institution of the church to mediate. That is, to be a go-between, a middleman for that relationship. Well, this is huge in terms of ideology, because the church as an institution, which was, in a sense, the overarching government, at least the ideological government of the Middle Ages. To attack the church was to attack the whole system of feudalism, of the rule of the largest landowners and aristocrats, and all of that was justified through the church. So then, soon after, in the 15 teens, I think around 1517, when Martin Luther did this, soon after that, a great peasant war erupts in Germany. And another person who is not a philosopher, but is a priest, is the leader of it. And his name was Thomas Munzer. And that war, a class war for the redistribution of land, and carrying with it the ideology, the anti-clerical, anti-church, anti-feudal ideology, was a kind of a harbinger of what European history would be for the next 400 years or 500 years. A history of class conflict, a history of wars between classes, ideological conflict, setting the boundaries and the context of it, and ultimately leading to the rise of Marxism and modern communism. But to get to that, you had to go to the 1600s. And we then talked about Rene Descartes. And Rene Descartes' famous dictum is cogito ergo sum, which is Latin for I think, therefore I am. And what he said in substance is that I am human because I can think. Thinking only exists among human beings. And we humans were endowed by God with the capacity of thinking. I'm going to say more than thinking because that's what Descartes ultimately gets to. To reason is endowed in human beings by God. Again, like Martin Luther, what Descartes is saying is that each individual, because he or she can think, is directly connected to God. These capacities are not endowed in individuals by the church. You see the ideological clash. At the time that Descartes is writing, perhaps the bloodiest war in European history up till the First World War, the 30 Years' War, from about 1618 to 1648. It was a multi-level conflict where not just the feudal lords versus the peasant rebels or those in the Catholic Church who wanted to reform it against those who were counter-reform, or it was not just the struggle between states and principalities based upon whether they were ruled by Protestants or by Catholics. You know, all of this was involved. It was, I would say, one of the first wars where war was waged not just against armies or armies against one another, but wars against the people. It was civil war and class war in the midst of what we might say were international war. All of the great questions of modernity and modern capitalism in terms of conflict can be associated with that war. So in a sense, the 30 Years' War in Europe may be or could be considered the first great modern war, where it's not just armies, but armies who will destroy people and individuals who are non-combatant to win their side. So Descartes is writing in a moment of deep transition and conflict. While Descartes, as we said last week, continued to claim to be a Catholic, a card-carrying Catholic, and I'm not saying they had cards back then, but a Catholic in good standing, he only hung out, debated with, thought about the world with Protestants, who in many parts of Europe were being burned at the stake, were being executed for their values and beliefs. In other words, to hang out with Protestants, Protestant from the word protest, was to hang out with revolutionaries. Literally, if you compare it to the US 1950s, to hang out with Protestants was like hanging out with communists in a time of bitter anti-communism. So we were reading Descartes, not only from the standpoint of what his meditations and other writings said, but we were reading him in the context of history, of the context of the battle of ideas, in the context where ideas could get you in prison, executed, driven into exile. But that is always the way it is. In a moment of profound change, ideas and ideological struggle comes to the fore. Often those ideas and the ideological struggle is talked about in ways that don't reveal the ideological essence of what's going on. And certainly if you get 300 or 400 years down the line, oh, let's just come to an agreement. We'll call it philosophy, you know, which is kind of a way of watering down what actually was going on, and literally the courage it took for some of these people to stand up for the ideas, or we could say philosophies, that they expounded. In that sense, I look upon Descartes as a revolutionary in a time of conflict, class conflict, and conflict of ideas. Now, was he Marx, or was he the left wing of the French Revolution? Not at all. In a lot of ways, he could not publicly be more than what he was, because the struggle was still not yet decisive. And of course, I guess he wanted to live, so he, you know, was a little bit cryptic. He phrased things in ways that were not so obvious. For example, Descartes was a dualist. You know, he was a rationalist. He believed in reason. He believed in knowledge. He believed in science. He did not believe that faith could be a substitute for science and reason. And he did not feel the church could be the ultimate judge of truth and could not guide the expansion of knowledge. Descartes, of course, was a scientist, what we would call a polymath, but he did a lot of work in mathematics. In particular, we would know him through analytic geometry and the Cartesian point in an analytical geometric sense. So he was this, you know, unique figure. He could not come out completely. We're still in that transition. The struggle would not be decided for at least a century and a half, at least that. But nonetheless, the movement of ideas and this great ideological struggle lasted for, I mean, in this sense, for at least 2 centuries, maybe more, maybe 2.5 centuries. I mean, that gives you a sense of the way things might evolve in our moment of crisis, conflict, and struggle. It would take many more framings of these questions to come to a resolution. And in particular, the weakness, I don't know if I made this clear enough, the weakness of Descartes' philosophical system was the idea of dualism. That there was reason, but then there was God. That kind of, as they say, God is still in control. I just don't like the church getting involved. You know what I'm saying? Very interesting move. But then I want to talk about a few people and philosophical schools today, and that is what we call British empiricism. Empiricism is spelled E-M-P-I-R-I-C-I-S-M. It was a uniquely a British movement, not continental Europe. It is identified with essentially 3 people. David Hume, who was the major one, George Berkeley, and John Locke. We know John Locke more in this country because of his theory of the state. And then we want to move to Immanuel Kant, still of the 18th century. Hume is of the 18th century as well, that is the 1700s. And then to Hegel, and maybe we'll kind of begin Marx. But let me first say about the British empiricist. The British empiricists backed away from reason as the final arbiter of truth. They would argue, and I'm talking now mainly about David Hume. His last name is spelled H-U-M-E. David Hume would say that we can know the world through our senses and through experience. Well, that sounds very modern, very contemporary, and it is. Very influential in Anglo-American or English and American thought. They said we have no way of knowing things in themselves. We only know them in our relationship to them. And the way we come to know them is through our senses. Now, the senses do not tell us what caused a certain event, what the effect was. It makes no claim, the senses make no claim to reason or logic, okay? But what the senses do and what the empiricists established is that we have a direct relationship with the world and other people through our feelings, through our sensations, and not through our reasoning. Reasoning comes in to the picture when we invent cause and effect, when we invent a way of arranging and giving meaning to all of these experiences, right? It's a great move in a lot of ways. Again, it is a move totally away from the church's dogma. By this time, I should add, the English as a nation had broken with the Catholic Church and established more than 100 years earlier, the Church of England, which we in the United States call the Episcopal Church. which is very Catholic in many of its rituals and so on, but very Protestant in other ways. So Episcopalian, or the Church of England, is a national church breaking with the Catholic Church, Catholic meaning universal or all inclusive, and establishing a national church, which itself became a compromise between the Republican forces, that is Cromwell and the parliamentary forces, and the aristocratic or monarchist forces, the royalists, as they called them. Very interesting struggle in England. And you know, you still have these two sides in England. You have the Queen of England or the King of England, and then you have the Parliament. But the Queen has lost, or the royal family has lost over time most of its power, if not all of its power, and it's more symbolic. If you went back to the 16th and 17th centuries, it was real power, and it was linked not mainly, the royal family was linked to other royal families throughout Europe. At the time of Elizabeth, it was the Spanish or the Germans. In fact, the current royal family in England, the Windsors, as they are called, are really German in origin, you know, not even English. You could use even the example of the Tsar of Russia, who were more French than they were Russian. So even though the monarchies claimed that they were sovereign and ruled over the people of England or Russia, but they were really connected more to other monarchies than they were to their own people. Very interesting story. So when you have this the English civil wars of the 1640s, it is the Parliament which claims sovereignty from the people and not from the monarch. This is very interesting. And so you have two theories of the state which emerge. One is Thomas Hobbes. He says that either we have order or we go back to the brutal state of nature. And then you have John Locke, who, by the way, was a participant in the Royal African, not committee, what do you go, Royal African, what do you call it? The Royal Africa Company, yeah, that's what I'm doing. The Royal African Company, which had from the King of England total monopoly over the slave trade. We know Locke helped to write I think it was the Constitution of the state of North Carolina, and had a big philosophical role in the writing of the Constitution of the United States. John Locke differed from Thomas Hobbes, who said order at any cost, no matter what it costs. There must be order and security so that whatever people do, they can do it in the context, in the framework of a secure and ordered society. And that's where you get the idea of the state as the ultimate and only legitimate institution to use force and violence against the population. That's Hobbesian. It would be, just to get a little ahead of ourselves, it'd be picked up by Lenin and Marx, really. And today you hear people in talking about the crisis of the bourgeois state, the Western state, often reference Hobbes. Now, of course, Locke was more in favor of the parliament. And he would say that, yes, we come from a state of nature. It's a very dangerous world out here. But let's organize rule and government based upon law and a set of institutions that are ultimately legitimated by the people. So Locke kind of is an overarching thinker in what we today call electoral democracies, political rule by law, that no one is above the law, not even the president. In the case of England, not even the monarch. You know, it's very interesting. But then I want to get back to David Hume, who I feel is very interesting, very contemporary. The sense that we know the world through our experiences in the world, but then the idea that all of the meaning that we give to those have nothing to do with absolute truth or absolute knowledge, but are invented to give order to and meaning to what we are living, what we are doing, and so on. So, I mean, in a certain sense, much of the explanation of postmodernism, which claims to be anti-scientific, which in a certain way is anti-Rene Descartes, they would say that all of this is an invention, that reason is put on its high platform, not because it is so, how would you say, can so easily, I got the wrong words, not because reason is the path to absolute truth. It is because we, in our culture, in our habits, impose reason, impose order. You will get that in the 20th and 21st century in the French philosopher Michel Foucault, the other French philosopher Derrida. It's really deeply rooted in aesthetics and literary studies, etc. Now, what Hume is getting at is what we will later call phenomenology, from the word phenomena, or the study. Ology is a study of, the study of phenomenon. Phenomenology is a word that we can often say it's similar or the same as epistemology. Epistemology is a word meaning the study of the ways that we come to know the world, you know, or another word is a theory of knowledge. So phenomenology is a study of the way we know things and the way we give meaning to things. Epistemology, you might say, is a bigger word, a more overarching concept, which is the study of knowledge and how we come to know. It is, epistemology is often encased or bounded by or located in philosophical discourse. Phenomenology, well, maybe phenomenology is a bigger concept because it's used in so many other areas, even psychology, not to mention art and literature. But phenomenology, again, is the study of phenomena. Most phenomenologists would say, if you want reason to play a role in this, you have to see reason as a way of inventing, of human invention of meaning, of human establishment of meaning, of order, of connections, of cause and effect. There is no objective truth for phenomenology. I want to underline that. Hume the empiricist and phenomenology of that type is what we call subjective idealism. Everything is about the individual, and it's not anything about objective truth or absolute truth or any of that. Remember, Descartes believed that science was the pathway to knowing the essence of the universe or of the world as we live it. David Hume challenges that. There is no objective truth. There is no absolute truth. There is no essential truth, underlining the word essence. Because once you say that, no, we should and can, we should strive to know essences, things at their basic core, something like what natural science claims, you know, a kind of absolute truth, an invariant truth. Well, that brings us to Immanuel Kant. And if you want to know how to spell his name, it's with a K. K-A-N-T. Immanuel Kant is born in the 1700s and he dies in 1804. Immanuel Kant never leaves the village that he was born in. So while he would talk about the world, he knew very little about the world outside of ideas and speculation. But in many ways, Kant might be, and you can get all kind of disputes about this, the most important and influential philosopher in the modern West. What does Kant do? Now, of course, Kant is living in a completely different period from Descartes or even from David Hume or Thomas Hobbes. Things have kind of settled down. Europe can proclaim itself European. It can speak of itself vis-a-vis humanity in racial terms, in terms of what we would today call white supremacy, that there is a European world, a European ideology, a European way of thinking and going about things, a European political economy, a European way of doing what they would call democracy, from the Greek word, rule of the people, and all of that, which in their minds, although very few of them had traveled outside of Europe, was radically different from what the explorers and merchants and others had observed in Africa and Asia. And they would conclude that the European way of doing things was a representation of progress, putting Europe and its ideas in the vanguard of the movement of history. Okay? Kant was one of those people. He didn't know the world, but he thought about the world and he speculated about the world. But his importance is where he is situated in the struggle between empiricism, we can only know things through experience, and rationalism, that reason is the pathway to knowing things in themselves or knowing the essences of things. Kant, I think, is great in the European movement of ideas and philosophy because he is a great synthesizer. You know, back then, continental Europe, the Catholic Church, a whole lot of things was seen as different from England. Both sides saw it like that. The English had a different kind of revolution from the bloody revolutions in the continental Europe. Now, the British were very brutal and bloody too. I mean, they killed kings and queens, they chopped off heads, they burned people at the stake. I mean, this was some deep stuff. But what Kant does is literally cross the English Channel, brings the empiricists, Hume, Berkeley, and John Locke, into a way of thinking and doing rationalist philosophy. And here is what Kant did. Again, the great synthesis. He said, indeed, David Hume is right. We do experience the world through our senses, through experience. So at that point, Kant is a phenomenologist. But he says, hold on. There's something else going on here. And this is that we are equipped by the nature of who and what we are, that is, as humans, with the capacity to reason. It's not a cultural habit. It's not something that we impose external to experience, but we are equipped with that. And he would write, and I think his most important work entitled The Critique of Pure Reason, that we know the world and we understand phenomenon because we are equipped with the rational capacity to know the world. So people say, well, what's the difference between Kant's rationalism and Descartes' rationalism? Well, one important thing, what Kant called the a priori. A priori is a Latin word meaning before the fact. He calls his major book The Critique of Pure Reason. I want to underline pure, which is the giveaway and lets us know he's doing metaphysics. That is, what happens before we experience the world, before we write about the world, before we even think about the world. There is a set of equipment, a set of capacities that are rational capacities. Reason is built in to the human being. Now, just to make a comparison, everybody knows Noam Chomsky. Before everybody knew Noam Chomsky, there was a linguist named Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is a neo-Kantian, maybe a Kantian all the way. Although I think he sometimes says he is indebted to Descartes as well. But he's neo-Kantian in this sense, that language is something that we learn, yes, but we have the capacity before learning occurs to speak. Okay? That's a Kantian move. That is an a priori condition that gives us the ability or the capacity to speak. Kant said the same thing. And Kant said, therefore, there is a process in reasoning where categories, and in his pure reasoning, he said the two fundamental categories are time and space, right? That these categories give meaning and shape in a rational way the experiences that we have. It's not an invention. It's a built-in capacity. Now, Kant makes another move, and when you dig this, you're going to see what happens after Kant. He makes another move, and that move is that, how can I put this? Oh yes, that where, Descartes and others said, we can ultimately know it all. We can know things, we can discover absolute truth, fundamental truth. what Kant does is goes back to England and the empiricists and says, no, even with the rational capacity that is built in to our very being, even with his identifying, that is Kant's identifying of the major categories of thought, and the fundamental ones, again, are time and space. You know, that is kind of Kant's gesture towards science, you know, especially physics. Even with all of that, we can only know things, and I hope everybody can get this word, in their phenomenal form, not in their essential form. He made a distinction between phenomena and noumena. Noumena is spelled Noumena. Phenomenal form is the experiential form of things, you know? Noumenal is what he would call essence. We can never know essences, but to the extent that we experience the world, and he would call laboratory experiments or astronaut, you know, knowing the world through astronomy as experience. But we will never know the thing in itself, as he put it. We will know the thing as we experience, or as he would put it, the thing for us, not the thing in itself. These are very, very important concepts for not just philosophy, but for linguistics, for for art, for psychology even. You know, one of the things about Freudian psychology and dealing with the subconscious mind, you know, really what I think Freud was talking about is the non-rational or irrational mind, you know? I could, in a certain sense, trace some of that back to Kant. And of course, for Kant, I mean, for Freud, whether or not the ego, or for that matter, the superego, civilization and culture, can override and control the irrational. It's almost a Kantian move. For Kant, the rational apparatus shapes the way we know and give meaning to the phenomenological. Kant, therefore, is highly identified with what we today call phenomenology. A lot of people would say that phenomenology is one part of philosophy. I would argue that pretty much phenomenology is what philosophy has become. In its in its existential form, a lot of ways in its postmodern identity politics form. There's a politic that is now associated with phenomenology that we can talk about. But phenomenology, the idea of phenomena, the world, or the struggle to know the world, not in its essential forms, but in the ways that the world exists for us. Many people are familiar with a big debate, I think it's still going on in academics, where people talked about essentialism and how essentialism was a bad thing. Well, there are two ways to argue against essentialism. There is a phenomenological way, which most of the arguments were against essentialism, and there's a historical way, which seldom was the case. We can get back to that. But that's pretty much Kant. Kant is a very prolific writer. He writes 3 critiques. The Critique of Pure Reason is this highly metaphysical, theoretical, philosophical book. Then he writes a critique of judgment, which is a critique. And by the way, critique should be understood as investigation. A lot of people say, oh, critique is what we talk about when we talk about critical theory. Not necessarily so. In the ways that Kant was using it, it was an investigation of pure reason. He writes then this critique of judgment, which is an investigation of aesthetics. What is beautiful, what is good, what is true, you know, kind of going back to Platonic discourses on beauty and truth. And then he writes a third one called The Critique of Practical Reason, which is a study of ethics. And I don't want to get into all of that because he goes about it in a way that defends and upholds bourgeois organization of society, a bourgeois legal framing of society. By bourgeois legal, I mean kind of like what Locke was talking about, that institutions and leaders and political leaders and so on had to be legitimated by the people, and they had to be constrained by law. Kant, for example, takes the 10 Commandments as a basic or fundamental ethical law, and then shows how to rationally extend them to a societal norm. But then another German rises up, and his first book was published in the same year that Kant dies. And that next philosopher is Hegel, Hegel. Everybody that's a Marxist or influenced by Marxism up to the postmodern period associated Hegel as the greatest philosopher in European history. Hegel bitterly, and I mean bitterly, opposed Kant. I mean, he literally called him a sellout, a bootlicker for the English, and I could use other words that are not permitted, I think, on Facebook. But I think Hegel used in relationship to Kant. And Hegel raises the question, why can't we know essence? You know, anything that said that knowledge was limited only to phenomena and not to essence, not to fundamental things, was a sellout and a limitation upon knowledge. Hegel would even refer to it as counter-revolutionary. Well, why would he use such language? Well, you just had a great revolution in 1789, the greatest revolution in European history up to that time. And it was deep and profound. Remember, from at least the 1500s, if not a bit before, all of these class wars, all of these national conflicts, all of this overthrowing and of monarchs and burnings at the stake and executions and heads being cut off, all of that was going on for this long period. And suddenly it manifests in its highest form to that point, the French Revolution. Kant was not only an unapologetic supporter of the French Revolution, but he supported its extreme left wing, which was Robespierre and the Jacobins. Now, I'm not certain, but he could have also supported Babu and the communist side of the revolution. I don't know, maybe some others can help us with that. but he definitely supported the French Revolution as liberatory. Remember, he's in Germany, or one of the German states. It was not a German nation at that time. And he saw, in a lot of ways, he saw the French Revolution as liberating Germany. That Germans had a lot of philosophy, but the German people did not have leadership, and the German people did not have, I won't say the will, but the capacity to take power. You know, Kant saw the French Revolution in ways that Beethoven saw Napoleon. He would be disappointed ultimately that it is Beethoven. Kant dies in 1804, so we don't know what he may have thought about the ways that the French Revolution went, especially the rise of Napoleon. But Hegel, who also supports the French Revolution, does it from a side that is the opposite to Kant. Hegel writes a lot of books, but I think the two most important was the book that's published in 1804 called, and this is very interesting, The Phenomenology of Mind. Sometimes the interpretation is, the translation is The Phenomenology of Spirit. What is he doing in that book? It's a huge book. It's a very difficult book to read. He may have hated Kant, but at least Kant could write very coherently. Hegel, I don't know who taught him to write, but he can't write. I don't know who his editors were either, but anyway. If you don't have to read it, don't read it. But the basic thing is when he uses a phenomenology of the mind, phenomenology of mind, it is an investigation of reason and the potentiality and the possibility of reason, right? Now, Hegel would argue, and this was a bold move, I don't care how you cut it, that unlike Kant, we could know essences. The truth could be known and would be known, okay? But here is where Hegel makes a turn that no other philosopher in European history, modern European philosophy, ever made. And that is that the truth will emerge over historical time. No single epoch, in spite of the fact that humans had the capacity to reason, no single epoch would reveal absolute truth, except when the final period, when humans have reached the ultimate level of consciousness, where all truths through reason could be known. But everything is emergent. It unfolds over historical time, okay? Hegel introduces history as essential to reason. Great move in my opinion. And then he would write what I consider his magnum opus, The Science of Logic. I think it's published in 1819, somewhere around there. So almost 15 years after he writes his first work, Phenomenology of Mind, he publishes what I consider his greatest work, The Science of Logic. From the standpoint of Marxism, it is his great work. And it brings Hegel, in spite of the fact that he's an idealist, what we call an idealist, that ideas are moving history forward. In spite of that, he comes close to materialism. Recall, the great rationalists are all scientists also. So even the British empiricist, David Hume, was a scientist. What does Hegel say? He said, philosophy is the science of sciences. I mean, to me, this is an extraordinary statement. This is not philosophy as speculation. This is not philosophy as pure rationalism. It is not even philosophy as a social philosophy. He said, philosophy is the science of sciences. Philosophy guides and shapes and explains what the scientist does and is doing. And he openly says it in The Science of Logic. Scientists do great work, but they don't really understand their work. They don't really understand knowledge production. And that's the role of philosophy. Philosophy, in a sense, is methodology. You might also argue, when you get to his philosophy of history, that philosophy is the history of ideology. You know, so I think that Hegel is making some extraordinary moves, comes after the French Revolution. I mean, a liberatory process, people are freer. You know, you even have communists in the French Revolution, anti-capitalists in the French Revolution. So I'm certain that Hegel felt more free than even Kant. And he says that history and ideology has to be factored in to the struggle to know. I mean, it's almost like Marx or Lenin talking, you know? And in The Science of Logic, and this is the other thing, if you say everything is in constant motion, as Hegel claims, everything, including history, is constantly moving. Now, he would say in history, it's moving to an ultimate goal. That is what we call teleology. I can put that aside for the moment. I like the concept of movement, of motion. But then he asks the question, what makes for the motion that we see in all things, be it physics or biological phenomenon or chemical phenomena, or even in calculus. And all of these areas, he talks about them, all these areas of science, but he says they're all dealing with motion. And he says, what generates motion within things? And he says, all things exist as a unity of opposites. Okay, you can go back to early philosophy, early Indian, Egyptian, throughout Africa. You know, the idea of dialectics after Aristotle was viewed as primitive. Remember the three laws of logic that Aristotle put forward: the law of identity, the law of contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle. Law of identity is simple. You know, A and A are the same. The law of contradiction is that A and B are not the same. The law of the excluded middle is that a thing cannot be itself and its opposite at the same time. That's Aristotle. You know what I'm saying? A lot of people still go with that. If you're a computer programmer, hey, you do that every day. That's your thing. If you're creating the logs or logarithms for Facebook, that's what you're working with. But for Hegel, he would say, well, yeah, at that level, that's true. At a you might say superficial level. But he said in the deepest sense, everything exists as itself and its opposite at the same time, because everything exists in motion, in change, and that it is philosophy that discovers the laws of motion of things in physics, and I guess even in the uncertainty principle is very interesting. How would you apply dialectics to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle? But certainly you can study Einstein's theory of relativity through contradiction. You can study the laws of calculus, even the laws of infinity using the unity of opposite. Everything, and this is extraordinary. And I give Hegel all due respect, albeit he's a white supremacist. He's an ignorant white supremacist. He don't know the world, but he says that Africa is not a part of human historical. Hey, look, I give that to him. He was, he was backward. He didn't know a lot. But at this level, one has to say it's one of the boldest moves in the history of philosophy. That everything exists in motion, in the natural world and in history. This is what he called dialectics. In some ways, when it gets to history, it's different than physics or biology or chemistry. One could, in fact, accuse, when it came to history, Hegel of two major mistakes. One is the mistake of teleology, that there's a certain and inevitable motion to history, which that is not necessarily so. For instance, there's during the anti-slavery struggle, there is a white abolitionist named Theodore Parker who says that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Maybe, but then maybe the arc of the moral universe could force humanity into a situation that it cannot remove itself from, and thus could begin a process of its own destruction. I'm not saying that is the case, but you have to factor in, when it comes to history, and I think even to certain physics, the uncertainty principle. But that's another discussion. But I think one of Hegel's great mistakes was that of a teleology, that everything is being pulled forward by a final idea. And the other, I think, and I don't know that many people have investigated this, but I think it is the case, a certain positivism, where if it's true, if the method and philosophy is true in natural science, then ipso facto, that same law applies in pretty much the same way in historical sciences. Just in history, you can take the world, and Du Bois's thing, that race introduces something different. It is a uniquely human historical phenomenon that makes the certainty of the unity of opposites in history not so certain. But we'll come back to that. But Hegel, again, is this huge figure, that dialectics is a logical apparatus of logic that human beings apply to the understanding of phenomena, and that to know is not to know in a moment. He's saying that if you take Kant has given up on knowing. He's accepted a watered down version, but we can know. Hegel is therefore more optimistic. He says that everything emerges because everything is in motion. And that's the same with knowledge. That's the same with truth. We'll never know anything absolutely, but we will know things as they reveal themselves and as our methods and philosophy and everything become more sophisticated, we can know them as we become more capable of knowing them and understanding that things are emerging in historical time, we will know better. Now, just a final thing, I know I'm going too long on Hegel. Remember that Kant said that the two principal categories of knowing are space and time. Some would say location and time. How time is defined, I actually forget how Kant defined time. But the concept of time in phenomenology would reappear in the 20th century with the German philosopher Heidegger. Being and time. But Hegel took time out of the categories of knowing and made it actual, as an actual movement of things. To me, it's breathtaking. I love it. But it is the foundation of what would become Marxism as we know it, and the theory of the class struggle. Hegel is a huge influence upon all of the radical thinkers of the 1830s and 1840s going forward. It imbued them with a sense of optimism, a sense of courage, and a sense of, even though we might not see the end of this, in fighting for the future now, we are confident that the future will come into being, because history has only one direction, and that is progress. And Marx begins as a philosopher. But back then, well, for him, certainly, he was not looking for a job in a university. In fact, he was very, very critical of academics and academic knowledge. He would have to leave Germany because Germany, after 1848, as a good part of Europe, became hugely counter-revolutionary. So he goes to England. Those who talk about Marx, he's different than the others, than other German philosophers, in that he is, first of all, connected to history and time through his connection to the European working class. He is connected to history and time through his connection to the European working class. Unlike Hegel and Kant, who are connected to these categories through knowledge or reason itself. So, in a really deep sense, Marx does what no philosopher had done even during the period of the Enlightenment and the revolutionary struggles. He cast his fate and the fate of his ideas with a certain social class, and that was for him the European working class. The dialectic of history is not the dialectic of ideas, it is a materialist dialectic. So we would talk of Hegel as an idealist, as an idealist dialectics. We would talk of Marx's dialectics as dialectical materialism. That everything that is not thought in the Marxist philosophy is matter. Everything that is not the individual, the subject, is objective. By the way, it is Hegel that takes philosophy from the subject, as with David Hume and Kant and Descartes, and he says, no, these are objective processes. Marx seizes upon that. But he says that objectivity is not um, uh, uh, everything that we can define as objective in science. It is everything that is not thought, that is not reasoning. It is that whole universe of things that we want to know and to know them in order to change them. Okay, I'll stop there, Johan. I mean, I've talked too much, obviously.
Wow, no, that was excellent. Thanks so much for breaking all that down. I would now like to invite our viewers to post comments. The first comment, which is more of a reaction, from Brian Jones. He says, "Taking me back to school, Professor Monteiro."
Brian is an old friend of mine. What's happening, man?
Great. So I can start. I have several questions, but I'll start with maybe from if we can go back to the beginning a little bit of the presentation, when we were discussing Kant. In some ways, if you could talk a bit about some of the political questions they were engaged in. One thing I'm interested in is when you look into the history of peace and the philosophy of peace, Kant is an important figure because he helped popularize this in one of his essays, Perpetual Peace, about a proposal for world peace. So I don't know if you have any, I don't know if you're familiar with that particular essay, but if you could comment on what peace meant as a category or as a concept in this time, because it's also something we talk a lot about at the Free School.
Yeah. Well, I could say one thing. Peace for Kant was not anti-imperialist or anti-colonialist or anti-racist. His concept of peace is peace between powers, great powers, and rational nations. And as far as the colonial world, the enslaved peoples, and so on, and when Kant is writing, the slave trade is, going crazy. There was no need for peace with them. So he did not talk about peace as a total circumstance for humanity because he did not recognize humanity. There were humans who had these capacities, and there were others, the majority of people, who were not on the European level. So coming out of this long period of wars and civil war and class war, he wanted to set up a circumstance in Europe to avoid war, because wars were becoming more destructive. Now, that's pretty much what I would say on it. I mean, it's influenced a lot of international law because, see, and this is where, if I might just put this way, it's very interesting that here you have Kant, okay, and then you have Gandhi. And Gandhi's concept of peace is total. It's not just a legal or avoidance of war peace. It is a complete transformation of human beings where war becomes and violence becomes inconceivable. That's not, because I think Kant kind of goes back to social contract theory, to Locke, certainly Locke, and maybe something of Hobbes, that if you don't have a legal framework, an ethical framework, an a priori framework that says what are the do's and don'ts of national relationships, everything will fall apart. Gandhi is talking about something more total. So you get Kant and Gandhi, and then you get Dr. Martin Luther King. And he writes, My Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. And his pilgrimage to nonviolence is towards Asian and Indian philosophy. So that's the way I would put it, to make sense of it.
And I mean, just as a more general question, is it fair to say for essentially all the philosophers we've discussed today, I mean, the empiricists, Kant, and even Hegel, that they shared a sort of, as you put it with Hegel, white supremacy, or whenever they talked about these general human categories, like for example, pure reason with Kant, were they only considering Europeans as possessing those?
Oh, that's the underlying assumption. And see here's what the situation is. Like I said, how much I admired Hegel's boldness. So that doesn't mean I'm bowing down to Hegel or I'm a Hegelian. What I literally said is there is something of use in Hegel that we can appropriate going forward. And in that sense, to teach the theory of dialectics is to assist, let us say, younger people, I would say even elementary school kids, in understanding things like calculus, like analytic geometry. You know, for example, the concept of the infinite and the finite. It's not that one is this and one is the other. No, they coexist. And thus are in a dialectical relationship. Now, don't ask me how that operates in mathematics. Other people know this, I hope, better than I do. But, you know, the great Indian mathematician we talked about last, what's his name, the man who knew infinity?
Ramanujan, I think.
Yeah, Ramanujan. I am certain that a lot of his mathematical reasoning, because he's an Indian, because he comes from the rural countryside, was probably dialectical reasoning. And what astounded the mathematicians and professors in London was his novel equations and hypotheses, which I think reflected the ideological worldview situation of the Indian peasant, for whom things were in constant motion. You know, the so-called primitive man, which the rationalists looked upon the people of the dark world, and that dialectics was more common than pure logic or logic, or Aristotelian logic. So I think that saying that is not to say that Hegel was anything but a European in that modern sense, and anything other than, well, maybe he could have been otherwise, but he was a white supremacist. I'm told that Spinoza, in ethical terms, was far more advanced than the other rationalists in his sense of understanding humanity. But that's, yeah.
Right. Okay, so following up on Hegel, we have a question from Raju. He says, hi Doc, great lecture. There is a well-known quote by Lenin who said it is impossible to completely understand Marx's Capital, and especially its first chapter, without having thoroughly studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic. Could you say more of what he meant by that?
Well, I think it's very obvious what he is saying. The thing is that, you know, Lenin had these philosophical notebooks, and one of them, and it's very useful, I find, are his notebooks on Hegel's Science of Logic. So Lenin was very much involved in studying that, as was Marx. And what I think what Lenin was saying, and I guess what I would say also, is that the structure of Das Kapital, at least volume 1 and at least the first chapter, is to set up the opposites. For example, Marx in the first chapter establishes 2 forms of value: use value and exchange value. They are in a dialectical relationship, a relationship which creates a dynamic movement in capitalist societies. Another, and that's very, very important, that use value, exchange value. And then he shows, I think, and I don't have it before me, that that contradiction between use and exchange value is resolved in surplus value, i.e. profit. You see. Now he can set up a linear equation to demonstrate it, but that's a great example of it, that a deep assumption when reading Das Kapital is that capitalism is a dynamic system precisely because it is always in motion. It is always in this situation of the unity of opposites. You know, what Hegel would call the negation of negation. And so it is I mean, again, and Raju is right about this. You cannot underestimate the bold, intellectual, and imaginative project that Marx set upon in writing Das Kapital. You know, and you cannot read it as just another political economy. It is more than political economy. It is more philosophy and theory and ideology. You know, it is the total package. It is the complete work. Although it is not, it doesn't say everything or discover every truth about the economy, and you can't use it dogmatically. You can use it, especially for its method. Now, it's 4 volumes. I mean, and a lot of it, you know, for instance, take Marx, I think it is in volume 2, partially in volume 1, A Study of Money, a Theory of Money. Hey, man, now, the study of money dialectically may help us to understand the new forms that money will take in the throes of this great existential crisis of capitalism. So and and by the way, when you think of Das Kapital as a study in logic, in dialectical logic, it means a lot more than if you didn't think of it that way. So I agree with Lenin about that, and I just go further.
Okay, great. Nantha asks, would you say that Kant still affects the working class of the Western nations? In what way? Also, could you once again speak to the difference between Hegel and Marx? In particular, how did they both speak about the importance of ideas? And I just wanted to add onto that.
Can I just answer that first, man? That's a lot like that. Because I forget sometimes.
All right.
Okay. The relevance of Kant.
Yeah, particularly to the working class of I guess the working of the Western nation, sorry.
Yeah, I think Kant is huge. I think he's still very present in the formation of knowledge in the Western world. You know what I'm saying? If one went, let us say, to Mali in West Africa, and went among the Dogon people, I don't think that the form of reasoning associated with Kant would carry much weight in the ways that they think. This is interesting because also in Western societies, which are now in the throes of deep ideological, spiritual crises, I mean deep. So you get all of these huge challenges to Kantian thought, thinking through categories type of thinking. And a huge, I mean, just rejection and brutalizing of his thinking, you know, that it's popular to take a guy like Kant, you know, kick him to the ground and stomp him in the face. And so you get a lot of cheers when you do that. And yeah, you get that, because, forgive me for just my hesitant way of answering that question. You get that because of a civilization that does not know how to go forward ideologically. And see, the problem, I think, and this is to Nanditha's question, the problem is more ideological than it is philosophical. If you take Foucault, the problem is more philosophical and anthropological than ideological. If you take the novel, which we talked about yesterday, the problem of most novels is its lack of ideological anchorage. We know the people in these very narrow ways. We know them outside of history. We know them outside of ideology. But I think, for me, Kant remains relevant, not in its totality, but only if we reshape the ideological conditionalities of philosophy in general and Kant in particular. Can we appropriate it to a revolutionary project? I think Nanditha is also asking me, does the working class of the West think in rational terms rather than in other terms, this narrow rationalism? Now, I don't know how to answer that question. Maybe, maybe not. I think that working people would be more predisposed to give it up for something better that would help them understand the world. So it is more an ideological question. What was the other part of Nanditha's question? I'm sorry, Jahan.
Yeah, the other part was about the differences between Hegel and Marx, especially the importance to give to ideas. And it basically, it's good, it's very good, flows very well with the next question, which is on the same topic by Emily. So let me just add that. She says, thanks so much for this lecture. I've never really understood any of these specific philosophers whose name pop up all the time in classes, and how their ideas underpin our assumptions today in the West. I've heard of Hegel a lot as someone who influenced Marx, but I also know King and W.E.B Du Bois were shaped in their thinking by Hegel's ideas. Could you speak more about why you think figures like King and Grace were shaped by Hegel in particular, and how they appropriated Hegel's ideas? Why Hegel and not Marx then too?
Well, W.E.B Du Bois did her dissertation at Columbia on Hegel, which makes her so important for me. I mean, her journey is something just unbelievable. But just on Nanditha's the second part of the question, indeed, Hegel and Marx understood the historical importance of ideas. We would call that the historical importance of ideology. Ideology is an anchorage, not just ideas. And to Emily, yes, when you take philosophy in college, which has all of the negative sides of college education, it's like philosophy for finishing school. You don't have to know it, but you have to know the name. And, at cocktail parties, you can, throw names around. But indeed, there is more to this, and this is what I've been trying to argue. It's more to this than just philosophy. Certainly, there's more to this than academic philosophy. And unless you're willing and prepared to connect all philosophy to ideological struggles, to ideological conflicts, to ideological nuances, unless you're prepared to do that, you'll never understand anything in philosophy. And it's just like calculus. Most people that take calculus in college, even those that get A's in it, don't know calculus. And why is that? Because the professor doesn't know calculus. Why doesn't she or he know calculus? Because I think they don't understand it dialectically. The same with algebras, and you have all these algebras and all these geometries, but without an overall, I'd say philosophical, but then ideological framing of it. Because there are multiple ways to understand calculus based upon where one stands in the great ideological struggle for freedom of humanity. I mean, it all, it illuminates. Once you get the ideological thing and dialectically connect it to philosophy or science or math, then you can work, then you can think. I don't want you to tell me what to think. I just want to have the tools and possibilities of thought presented to me. And don't tell me that all the great discoveries in math have been in the European West. That's BS. So that's what I would say. I would say to anybody that finds philosophy and all of this confusing, well, that's the point of the way it's taught, to keep things confused.
All right.
Well, I'm not cynical. I'm very optimistic.
Right. But more specifically, this difference between Hegel and Marx about ideas, and particularly why does it seem that King also turns to Hegel, or seems, at least Emily is, I think, proposing, seems that King was more influenced by Hegel than by Marx, or I mean, how did he appropriate his ideas also as part of her question.
And the thing for all oppressed people when it comes to European ideas, do they believe in change? Mm-hmm. That kernel of history and change, hey, I like that. Mm-hmm. What is not permanent. It's transient. That's Hegel. Mm-hmm. And that's Marx, you know what I'm saying? So the oppressed have a natural predisposition to any philosophy that elevates the inevitability of change. Then I can see myself in it. That's what I would say.
I see. We have a similar question by Caleb that brings Du Bois into the picture. He says, hi, Doc, this has been really great. I was wondering if you could speak more to how Du Bois and King considered Hegel. As I understand it, King engaged deeply with Hegel during his theological studies at Boston University, and Du Bois incorporated ideas from the Phenomenology of Spirit within his own research and writings. Hegel's conception of history as being progress towards attaining the consciousness of freedom seems also to be reflected in King's own speeches. Should we then see Du Bois and King as advancing beyond Hegel's thought on the basis of Hegel?
Well, to the last part, I'd say yes, they do advance beyond, because they see and know the world better than Hegel did. And the synthesis that King, for example, and Du Bois are talking about, you see it all over their work, is a great human synthesis, that all knowledge is valuable because all human civilizations are valuable. So they're transcending Europe and the narrowness of Europe, while at the same time appropriating from Hegel and Marx the idea of history. And not just history as facts, but history as movement, history as the struggle of ideas. Now, of course, I think this gets back to Nanditha, that Hegel saw ideas as apart from the material world and as shaping it, as moving it, as pushing it forward. Marx connected ideas to ideology and to social classes in society. That's very appealing to Du Bois. You know what I'm saying? That's very appealing to King, you know? And certainly you get like Grace Lee Boggs, you know, which is so phenomenal about her, you know, she is seeking to make Hegel real and concrete. And that's her life's work. So that's where I would see it.
Next question is from Colin Clement. He says, hey, Doc, really enjoyed your lecture today and last Sunday. I believe you said Kant gave permission to Europeans to declare their centrality in human history. Can you explain this further?
Well, you see, reason as the property of European man, you know, and many philosophers in this period have argued, and it really comes from Frantz Fanon, that the crisis of European man is the crisis of European reason. That's an interesting way of thinking about it, and that maybe gets back to something Nanditha was raising, that Europe and European man, and man and woman, I'm using a generic thing here, are shaped by the ways that they have been taught to think about the world. And reason has been defined by Europeans as a uniquely European capacity. Science is European, reason is European, technology is European. That's the way they would argue it. That Europe has endowed the world with reason and science and logic and so on. Interestingly, at the conference of writers and authors that James Baldwin writes about, the conference that was held in Paris in 1956, Richard Wright makes the bold and incorrect statement, or partially incorrect, there's a way you can get something out of it, that why should the slave hate the slave owner? Because didn't the slave owner bring him or her out of the backwardness of African tribal life into the light of the European Enlightenment? Well, the counter argument would be that the European Enlightenment is not the final end of the journey of human civilization, and that European man is not, and I'm using this phrase, man qua man, or man as man, and the rest of us are imitative, or should be imitative, of ideal man, which is European man, and ideal reasoning, which is European reasoning or rationality. So it is a, how would you say, it is, it's just such a horrible entanglement of race, of civilization, of whiteness, and claiming things that are not white, that is thinking and ideas, art and music, giving it a racial coloration, a racial essence. That was horrible and wrong, and has enfeebled thought at this time. And of course, like what we do, and it's so illuminating for me, is to one, enter into a critical engagement with a lot of the assumptions of the white world, but at the same time, to study the non-European or white world. And thus, in a dialectical way, a negation of the negation will emerge in history, which is what we're fighting for, what we identify with freedom, not false freedom, not fake freedom, not freedom, we're going to be free as long as it's within the context of white academia and ways that it talks about it. It is true freedom, which in Hegelian and Marxist terms emerges out of this dialectical process, what we call the negation of the negation.
Right. Next question is from Jeremiah Kim. He says, thank you for this lecture, Doc. Grace Lee Boggs, in her autobiography, talks about Kant's notion of the categorical imperative.
Right.
Quote, an unconditional moral obligation which is binding in all circumstances and is not dependent on a person's inclination or purpose, end quote. The free school's understanding of Du Bois's essay, Galileo Galilei, seems to align with Kant in the way we talk about the moral imperative. Do you think there is a way to bring together this moral imperative with Hegel's philosophy that truth emerges through the movement of history?
You know, I can't answer all these questions. It takes some time even to think about them. But
maybe you can start with the moral. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Well, just the categorical way that Kant frames the question. It is abstract, that the moral imperative is what you would do if you acted rationally. You know what I'm saying? Now, when we use it, of course, and I think the way a lot of people use it, the moral imperative is what you must do. And that's why when you connect it to King's understanding of the fierce urgency of now, it is that we, and so in that sense, it would seem that King unites the Hegelian notion of history and the Kantian notion of the absolute necessity to do one or another thing. But for King, and this is interesting because we talked about Marx, it is King ideologically connects the moral imperative to history and to the oppressed.
All right. Oh, did you want to add anything about Galileo Galilei, the Du Bois?
Not right now.
Okay, no problem.
You know, my head is beginning to spin these questions.
All right. I wasn't hearing.
No, I'm not asking for that we end it. I'm just saying.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, these are excellent questions people are raising. I think some of these maybe will continue to think about as we go forward. But the next one is from Eddie Barraza. He says, "Hi Doc, thanks for going in so deep. Could you describe how the European Enlightenment drew from Asia and Africa?"
Yeah, that's what we talked about a bit yesterday. I think the European Renaissance and the European 20th century, especially after World War I and World War II, began, I think begins to draw more on Africa and Asia. Hinduism remains or Buddhism and Islam remain, variables and factors in American and European thought. And many Americans and Europeans are converting to Eastern religions and spiritual systems. But when you get to the Enlightenment, and I'll make this argument, I hope I'm right, it was the dialectics of the class and ideological struggle which was driving the Enlightenment. That struggle for power, which went on for at least 2 centuries, while at the same time the world was changing, of course, with the slave trade and, but that internal struggle was what was driving the Enlightenment, the Reformation, and the Counter-Reformation. And, now Du Bois makes the argument at the beginning of World War I that there were African roots of the war. But I sometimes think of it as multiple conditionalities. There are many things in human history that go on at the same time. And you get this thing from Marxism. What is the principal contradiction? What is the contradiction that defines the situation in totality? And I think the Enlightenment, and certainly what you might call pre-Enlightenment, the Martin Luther, the Peasant Wars, the 30 Years War, the English Civil War were a part of the unity of opposites, the dialectics of feudalism, which is transitioning to capitalism.
So now it seems that you're applying the Hegelian Marxian philosophy to understand the history of the development of this period as well.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do.
Right. So Serafina has a question. Thanks and hello, Doc. Serafina here. This might get ahead of this lecture, but could you talk more about time and its relationship to change in accordance to collapse of Europe as proposed by Du Bois? If historically the battle of ideas started during the 30 Years' War, what does a revolution or transition of power, or even to define power and freedom, mean for our times? Thinking about the dialectical / triad idea.
Some of these questions, could we come back to them in coming weeks? I have a little time to think about that.
Right.
What was the first sentence in Serafina? Not I, Doc, but the other part.
Oh yeah, she said, could you talk more about time and its relationship to change in accordance to the collapse of Europe concept as proposed by Du Bois?
Could we hold off on that?
Sure.
See, the question is a definition of time, but the way time, the other one is the way time functions. Is social time the same as physical time? What is the dialectical relationship between time and space? So these are very, very difficult, unanswered questions in both physics and philosophy. For example, you take Einstein's theory of relativity. E equals mc squared. Very simple, but very profound. The c squared is is time in motion, or matter in motion, which is a measure of time, which brings another question of time. Time as measure, a way to measure things in motion. So I would have to respectfully say to Serafina that I'm kind of in the kindergarten of theories of time, but I will do research, and hopefully when we get to existentialism, which I think is next week, maybe we can talk about existential time, and even the concept of a relativity, a time that is relative and that bends. That is the concept of horizons.
That also reminds me of some of the discussions we had about James Baldwin, and I think it was from Staggered Wonders, his concepts of time and history. I mean, maybe that's something you'll want to get into.
Yes, let's do that.
Well, I mean, I don't know if that's something you want to save for
next time.
Yeah. I was just thinking of that.
And don't even start with Sun Ra.
Right. We'll have to bring in Sun Ra, and we'll also have to bring in, art and music and so on more specifically. But we have a question from Raju. He says, I can see how Chomsky uses Kant's a priori in his linguistics.
Yes.
Though perhaps he does not use it explicitly in other places, I feel the notion of an a priori extends for him to other fields, even possibly in morality through the idea of a, quote, universal human nature, end quote. Do you think the concept of the a priori continues to be useful, but that it may be historically and civilizationally contingent?
Yeah, all of this is historically and civilizationally contingent. That's part of the beauty of this moment, that we see and can understand contingency in new ways and see it. Yeah, so yeah, definitely contingency. But, you know, I think that in some ways, Chomsky sees himself as a Marxist, but a Marxist with an anarchist bent. He calls himself, or defines himself politically as an anarchist. But if you listen to Chomsky, the very rational, objective commentator, I'm always feeling that I'm listening to a Kantian. See, the thing also about Kantianism is it's a closed system. It's a closed rational system. It is a system that is overdetermined by the a priori categories. You see what I'm saying? I can't tell you why completely, and I've felt this for so long, that when I'm listening to Chomsky, I'm not listening to so much a Hegelian or a Marxist, but to a Kantian who reasons on the basis of overdetermining a priori categories. It's easier for me to describe it to you than to give a full exposition of why I feel that way. If you put something that, a discussion that Chomsky is having about something in current events and so on, I could show you how it works. The other thing is that Chomsky's Kantianism or neo-Kantianism inhibits him being a revolutionary. Think about it. Just listen to a Martin Luther King speech, let us say the letter from a Birmingham jail, okay? And then let's listen to Noam Chomsky's speech. They are in substance and in a lot of other ways as different as day and night, you know? Yeah, I could show it better than I can describe it.
So is it fair to say, do you think, well, I mean, we've discussed about how Kant's a priori and concepts of reasoning are coming from, European civilization and the historical moment. So is it fair to say with someone like a Chomsky who's living in this moment, part of his inhibition is that his a priori reasoning is totally shaped by, Western civilization and so on.
Question.
That's a struggle too. Whereas perhaps a King is more open,
right,
to other forms.
That's why my pilgrimage to nonviolence, which is really a study of his pilgrimage to Eastern and African and an openness to the world of humanity, as opposed to Chomsky. And you're right about this. It is closed. It is already certain fundamental assumptions, a priori conditions of knowledge, and this is, I think I would agree with you, Joe, that what you sense in him, first of all, as Western civilization descends further into crisis, Chomsky descends further into pessimism and even depression.
So perhaps the crisis of Western civilization produces a crisis of this a priori knowledge.
That should be pursued, Joe.
Right.
So I have another dissertation for you. I'm going to give you a list of possible dissertations that you could choose from to do. You're welcome.
So it's 4:05, but we have a few more questions, if that's all right.
Yes.
Nandita asks, I apologize if this is too reductive a question, but which of these philosophies do you think the ruling class most proceeds from?
None. I think at this point, we're looking at this particular time, this moment, the American ruling class, I can speak better for, have abandoned all philosophy is now feeling bare and naked in the face of a crisis that it has no solutions for, and sometimes acts like they're prepared to throw in the towel and give up. Something like in China, in the collapse of the dynastic rule, Sun Yat-sen and those just walked in peacefully and took power. Sometimes ruling classes give up. And part of their giving up is their abandonment of thought and ideology. Now, of course, I mean, you have these armies, legions of academics that are always finding new ways to reform, or as they sometimes say, radicalize Western philosophy, bourgeois philosophy. And they're churning it out, you know, day and night. But maybe the ruling class is on the cusp of just giving up. You know, part of this is they can't defeat China. They can't defeat the new alliances emerging in the world. They can talk trash, and they're good trash talkers at times. But that is daunting for them, you know, given the history of the Cold War and then the collapse of socialism in Europe, and they were proclaiming the end of history and the beginning of bourgeois democracy as a world phenomenon. And now, 30 years after that, it doesn't look so rosy for them. It's, you know, it's like, I don't know whether you've ever been punched in the stomach. You know, it kind of takes your breath away. And they seem in some ways to have received a blow to the stomach. And they just are reeling. It's a hell of a thing to say. Now, you know, we were talking about this yesterday in the free school, because this is having an effect upon young people. And young people are very decisive at a moment like this. And, you know, as a generation, the younger generation are going to have to find their footing. And in finding their footing, find their confidence and their courage. Because they can win this fight. We can win this fight. How long it will take, we don't know. But we have to fight. And we must not adopt the attitude of the ruling class and the elite and take it on ourselves, well, we're going to agree with them. No, we have to have our own way of looking at the future and fighting for it.
Right. Well, a related question to none of us is from Jacob Harris. He says, I'm curious, to me it seems like Kant and phenomenology tends to divorce itself from the world around it, which seems to be useful for the ruling class. Is this true?
Oh boy, divorcing itself. You know, it's hard to put it that way. For me, it's not the same type of engagement that you would get from Marx or the communists, who say that ideas must be the property of the masses, that the truth or untruth of ideas is discovered in the historical struggle for freedom and for liberation. That is a different kind of engagement. That's a whole new higher stage than what Kant was doing. And you're right, Jake, Kant's predisposition towards pure reason means abstraction without concreteness. And of course, I think Hegel seized upon the failure of that position when he argues that at the end of the day, ideas become a material force and as such become concrete. I don't think that Kant, in all of his writings, had a concept, an adequate concept of the concrete, was all abstract and pure reasoning. I think he was aware of science and the need to rationally justify science as against not science. You know, one of the things that cannot be underestimated is that Kant was an atheist as well as a supporter of the French Revolution and its far left wing. I mean, that is highly significant. So he did see the world, at least Europe, but he was not a Du Bois. He was not a Baldwin, for whom ideas only made sense if they became the property of people fighting oppression. You see it all over Baldwin, by the way. Yeah.
If I could ask a follow-up about something that no one has asked about so far, which is when you were discussing Hume and you were talking about Hume's arguments about knowledge is sort of emerges from the senses, and I think you had mentioned he had a criticism of the idea of objective truth. And you basically had argued that, mentioned that there's kind of a thread from Hume that was picked up by postmodernists.
Yes.
And perhaps, I mean, would you say it's fair to say identity politics?
Yes. Yes.
That's some of the things we've talked about at the Free School: identity politics, postmodernism, and the kind of nihilistic effect it's had on young people. So maybe, I mean, if you wanted to.
Yeah, no, that's very important because, see, a kind of Hume's relativism, because it's all subjective. It's all about the individual. And that's in part the crisis or the problem that Kant is trying to resolve with these inherent structures of reasoning. But it's also that which Hegel attacks Kant viciously for, and Hume, this idea that it's all subjective and all about me and my experiences. That's all over identity politics. So much so that you cannot even have or think about a criteria of critique, or not even if you don't have a criterion. You critique me. If you critique my ideas, you're attacking me. You know, in other words, it's taking Hume to a diabolical extreme that he could never imagine. I mean, this is the shutdown of discourse, the shutdown of the dialogic of knowledge. It is an attack upon knowledge itself, which does come out of postmodernism. Who are some of the people I want to talk about? I mean, out of the whole French 19th.
Derrida, Foucault.
Yeah, and philosophical anarchism, philosophical relativism, that nobody's right and nobody's wrong, you know? But then they're caught in a contradiction because if you critique them, then you're a fascist.
Right.
You know, I mean, how you can, so it's this, you know, wild, having it always at all time, and my ideas are mine, and you know, it's a form really of infantilism.
Would you apply that same critique to you know, groups like Combahee River Collective, thinkers Audre Lorde? I mean, do you see that same thread from Hume?
Well, you know, whether they're aware of it or not, I'm not saying that people are saying, oh, I'm using a Humean phenomenology to explain feminism or Black feminism. But, you know, the giveaway with the Combahee document is when they went to the idea of identity politics. And Barbara Smith, who was one of the authors of the Combahee Declaration, says that she had done a search, word searches and others, and that she was the first person to use the concept identity politics, or the use of the concept intersectionality, as a way to replace the notion of dialectics. I mean, it's, you know, um, there's so much, as they say, in the subtext of so many of these postmodern discourses. Yes, in some ways it's a return to a kind of phenomenology, but it's a cheap phenomenology. It's people doing phenomenology that don't really know what the hell they're doing, and try to enforce their ideas through a kind of intellectual thuggishness. But sometimes, as they say, when the masses are in motion, you better be careful about how you put into practice thuggery, because you might not be all of that. I just say that. But this, it really is a imposing upon young people a pessimism and nihilism. You can't know the world, so you're not going to change it, type of thing. So yeah, I can see that, and I would make that argument, and I would make it to people who are prepared to debate the issue. Mm-hmm. If you're not prepared to debate the issue, I'm not prepared to enter into a discussion with you, because at the end of the day, I feel that the most important factor in all of this, first the Black proletariat, and then the working class as a whole. And if they can't hear you, if your ideas are not verified in a practice that engages them, then hey, you can talk, like they say, talk is cheap.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it seems like to me a great irony that these thinkers that are claiming that they're the most radical, break in a way from white, philosophers are going back to some of these ideas, maybe from Hume or European phenomenology.
Yeah.
It also reminds me of the discussion we had, I think, in the beginning of the first lecture about the role of the European Church in promoting certain ideologies. And in some ways, maybe we can make similar the equivalence of the European Church today, the state, and by extension, perhaps the universities,
Absolutely.
Academia, the media.
Yes.
And these are so that forces us to think about which philosophies or ideologies are being promoted by those institutions. And like you were saying, I mean, the ways in which they try to impose them by shutting down the debates and bordering on thuggery sometimes, with censorship and so on.
Yeah, I agree with you, man. And that's why, young people who are prepared, in spite of everything, to struggle with ideas, are so valuable, very valuable, because most are not questioning the ideas that they embrace and where they come from and whose interests are served by those ideas. Those are the critical ideological questions. And that's why, without an ideological framing of things, looking at feminism alone, identity politics alone, you got to ask some ideological questions and some historical questions too.
All right, so now it's 4:18. I think we can move towards wrapping up. I'll read the last comment, positive comment from Grady. He says, thanks, Doc, for an amazing summary of so many complex philosophical ideas. Many expositions of them are complicated. Your explanation, however, simplifies them. You give clear snapshots of the philosophies, their place in the history of ideas, as well as the similarities and differences among them. This approach helps one see how and why the philosophies make sense, the perennial fundamental questions they grapple with, and the strengths and weaknesses of their logic and rhetorical strategies. Doc, your introduction brilliantly succeeds in demonstrating the influence of these philosophies on contemporary social visions and values, ideologies and institutions, as well as their contributions to oppression and liberation in our world.
Yeah, well, thank you, Grady. I mean, again, I say this, you know, I'm in a state of anxiety the days before these things happen, because the question is not to know, but to make things understandable, to create conditions for further investigation and discourse. And that's all I'm trying to do. And believe me, there is so much I don't know. You know, everybody I mean, a lot of people as undergraduates are drawn to philosophy because they're looking for fundamental answers. And I've been engaged with it, you know, since I was an undergraduate. But then on the other hand, I got away from it in its academic and traditional Western European sense. And I was looking for a way to frame Western philosophy in a way that acknowledges that we are in the throes of a change of epochs, moving from the age of Europe and European man and European reason to the age of humanity, with all of the uncertainties that involves. But, and that's what I've been, you know, believe me, and there's so much I don't know. And Grady's, one of Grady's favorite philosophers is Ludwig Wittgenstein, philosophy of language, which is a take from kind of a Kantian take, and does in philosophy what Chomsky does in the theory of language. But it's so much. But if we can open the door or open the mind to thinking and discourse in a time of uncertainty and depression, and I'm always concerned about my young heads, calling them and stuff, don't be depressed. You know, we can fight our way out of this. It's important that we do this. And I appreciate what you're doing, Jahan. I really do. And everybody that asks questions and who compliment me, and let's not go too far with the compliments. I'm not all that, believe me. It's a lot I'm still trying to get under my belt.
Well, Jamila K. Wilson says, great work as always, Doc. And I would also like to say, you know, I think on behalf of all our viewers, we appreciate all the hard work you've been putting into this. And I'd also like to thank all of our viewers today for the excellent comments. I think maybe some of them will note down, and maybe we might, you know, return to them in some of the future lectures. And so I would just like to tell everybody to mark their calendars for next Sunday, April 26th at 2 p.m. We'll be here for the third lecture and conversation in this series. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to say about.
Well, next week we're going to, you know, kind of fill out Marx a little bit more, but we're going to go to Lenin and the Russian Revolution, the rise of communism, and the existentialist rejoinder to communism. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's when you really get that in the real deal of politics, ideology, and philosophy.
Right, right. And Antonio Robinson says, awesome, awesome, awesome. Thank you, Dr. Monteiro.
Thank you.
All right, I think that's a good note to end on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.